On February 2nd, 1982, law enforcement in Ascension Parish in Louisiana made a grim discovery: the body of a young man floating in the Mississippi River near Darrow. The victim had no identification, and the remains were badly decomposed from days or weeks in the water. The sheriff's office treated the incident as suspicious since no COD was immediately evident. Despite some publicity at the time, no family ever came forward to claim him, and no clues to his identity emerged. An autopsy and forensic exam provided a general profile of the John Doe, while also underscoring the difficulties investigators faced. He was a white male, approximately 18 to 21 years old, and around 5 feet 9 inches tall, weighing about 130 to 140 pounds. He had brown hair, though eye color couldn't be determined at the time due to the condition of the remains. Notably, he had a slight overbite, a chipped front tooth, and several dental fillings. These dental details were documented in case they might later help identify him. The coroner couldn't pinpoint an exact cause, but noted no trauma on his body. No personal items were recovered, and his clothing was generic: a plaid Western-style shirt from Sears, blue jeans, a black belt, and Adidas sneakers. This common attire provided no unique leads. Unfortunately, the advanced decomposition also prevented officials from obtaining usable fingerprints. In 1982, without DNA profiling or centralized databases, the lack of identification evidence left investigators with very little to go on in the investigation. Over the decades, various theories have been proposed about what might have happened to the John Doe. Foul play is one possibility, as the body may have been dumped in the river to conceal a crime. However, this remains speculative since no obvious injuries were found on the remains. It's also possible that the death was accidental, for example, a fall from a boat or a bridge into the river. As years passed, the case was entered into national databases like Name Us, and a number of other men were ruled out. As for his identity, one prominent theory is that he was a hitchhiker from out of state. In the early 1980s, many young people traveled long distances by hitchhiking, and some disappeared far from home. This John Doe potentially fits the pattern of a traveler who died on the road with no one local to report him missing. 43 years later, the case is currently receiving renewed attention thanks to modern forensic tools. In 2025, the Faces Lab at Louisiana State University completed a new digital facial reconstruction of the John Doe, using his skull to reconstruct his face. The image was recently publicized by the sheriff's office in hopes that someone might recognize him after so many years. The sheriff's office asked that people share the image widely, so here I am doing my part. Notably, his profile on the Doe network indicates that his DNA was properly preserved. It's unclear if this DNA profile has been sent for forensic genealogy testing at this time. Notably, this process is still new and resource-intensive, so the spotlight generated by the new forensic facial reconstruction may get the ball rolling on this as well. In the autumn of 1969, a brutal crime in Oakland, California, left behind a mystery that endures to this day. On October 2nd, 1969, staff at the St. Louis Hotel on 7th Street in Oakland discovered the body of a recently deceased young woman in room 15. The scene was extremely grim and violent. An autopsy later revealed she had been beaten severely and then strangled, reportedly with a piece of her own clothing. The coroner determined she had died only a few hours before she was found, meaning the perpetrator likely fled not long before the body's discovery. There was no identification found with her, nothing that immediately gave away who she was. Oakland police detectives were faced with two urgent tasks: identify the victim and catch whoever was responsible for this horrific act. Early clues gave investigators some leads on the second task, Witnesses reported seeing the young woman enter the hotel room with a man earlier that day. The description of that man was alarming. It appeared to match Taylor Morris Teaford, a fugitive already wanted by the FBI. Teaford was a 34-year-old man with a history of violence, and he had been on the FBI's 10 most wanted list since 1968 for a variety of extremely violent offenses. According to later reports, Teaford was indeed suspected of attacking multiple women in Northern California around that time. Investigators came to believe that Teaford was the man in the hotel with the Jane Doe, and likely the perpetrator. In 1972, although Teaford was still at large, authorities charged him in absentia with the slaying of the unidentified woman. A warrant was issued for his arrest, and the case effectively became a hunt for a fugitive killer and of his victim. Teaford, however, evaded capture, and over the years, he was rumored to have been seen in various places across the country, but he was never arrested for this crime. By all accounts, he lived a life on the run. Given his age, he would be in his late 80s as of today, so it's quite possible he died a fugitive. With the prime suspect out of reach, the case stalled. Yet even as the search for Teaford went on, a parallel investigation continued to try to identify the young woman he was believed to have slain. Her fingerprints were taken and checked against databases of missing persons and criminal records of the time, but no match was found. In 1969, there were no DNA tests or national computer systems to aid the search, so investigators relied on physical clues and old-fashioned legwork. They carefully noted her appearance and belongings, hoping something would trigger recognition from the public. The victim was described as a white female, estimated to be in her late teens to mid-20s. She had short, dark brown or auburn hair and striking blue eyes, which investigators believe would have been a particularly memorable feature. Despite her youth, one distinctive feature stood out. She wore a partial dental plate replacing her upper front tooth. This was a professionally made denture piece and had been repaired multiple times, suggesting she'd lost that tooth sometime earlier and had worn the denture for a while. Investigators publicized this unusual detail, thinking perhaps a dentist or someone who knew her might recognize it. They also noted she had some faded scars along her right forearm and evidence of needle marks on her arms, indicating likely substance use issues. At the crime scene, in addition to the white knit dress she was wearing, there were several other articles of clothing presumably belonging to her. Investigators found colorful bell-bottom pants, a bright patterned blouse, a striped mini dress, a white sweater, and white knee-high boots. These fashionable, youth-oriented clothes painted a picture of a young woman living in the late 1960s style. All of these details were documented and released to the media in hopes that a missing persons report somewhere might match up, but initially, no leads materialized on her identity. Presumably, there may be additional details which weren't released to the media, though I would imagine at this point, the authorities couldn't be holding too much back. Or at least, I would hope that's the case, because at this point, the crime is almost 60 years past. So yeah, I think it's time to go for the Hail Mary pass. From the very beginning, the mystery woman's identity has been the subject of much speculation. Who was this young Jane Doe? And what circumstances led her into the company of a dangerous man like Taylor Teaford, or perhaps an as yet unknown, but also extremely dangerous individual? One early theory was that she may have been involved in escort work. This raised the possibility that the Alameda County Jane Doe wasn't an isolated case, but part of a series of slayings targeting women in this line of work in Northern California. The brutality of the crime and the hotel setting did align with what law enforcement often saw in cases of predators preying on vulnerable young women. The escort theory could explain why no immediate missing person report matched the victim. If she had been estranged from family or living under the radar, her disappearance might not have been noted right away. Another theory has been that the Jane Doe was a runaway or transient who traveled to California during the tumultuous late 1960s. The Bay Area was a magnet for young people in that era: hitchhikers, flower children, and those drawn by the counterculture movement. But sadly, not all of those journeys ended well. It's possible the victim had come from another state, leaving home as a teenager and losing touch with her family. Her substance use evidence might point to a difficult life on the streets or involvement in the 1960s counterculture. If she had been moving from place to place, her family, if she had one searching for her, might not have known she was in Oakland. Further missing persons records back then were not well coordinated nationally. This could explain why her identity didn't surface immediately. In 1969, a missing young woman from another jurisdiction wouldn't automatically be connected to an unidentified body in California. Even today, with the vast interconnectivity brought to us by the digital age, this is still the case, though to a lesser extent. Over the years, various potential identities have been examined. Periodically, when a long-term missing person case seemed to match the Jane Doe's profile, authorities would compare details. For instance, one candidate that drew attention was a teen girl who went missing from Missouri in 1963, around the same age and physical description. With this case, and with many others, fingerprints and dental records would later rule out any connection. In the decades since 1969, the case of the Alameda County Jane Doe has never been completely forgotten. Investigators and advocates continue to pursue new ways to identify her, even long after the trail went cold. One significant modern effort has been the use of forensic reconstruction to put a face to the victim beyond the old morgue photographs. This image has been circulated in law enforcement bulletins and online cold case communities. By sharing the reconstructed likeness along with details of the case, authorities hope that it might jog the memory of a witness or prompt a family member to come forward with information. After all, even though many years have passed, there is a chance that someone out there remembers a girl who went missing around 1969 and never knew what happened to her. Advances in technology have also opened new avenues. The late 20th century and early 21st brought DNA analysis into crime solving, and more recently, genetic genealogy has cracked hundreds of cold cases. In principle, this technique could be the key to giving the 1969 Jane Doe her name. Forensic genealogy involves extracting DNA from the remains, building a genetic profile, and searching genealogical databases for relatives. In practice, however, this case faces a hurdle: the availability of viable DNA. Records indicate that no DNA profile has yet been obtained from the victim's remains. Given the era of the case, her body may have been buried without the preservation of samples, or any DNA that exists might be highly degraded. That said, technology is constantly improving, and even trace genetic material from decades-old evidence can sometimes yield results now. There have been discussions about exhumation or retesting old evidence to try to get a DNA sample. If successful, investigators could potentially enlist organizations that specialize in cold case identifications to apply genealogical research. On the afternoon of July 31st, 2001, a group of people walking along the banks of the main river in Frankfurt's Need district noticed a strange bundle floating along. And just a quick programming note on this case. I found out about it way back when I started this series, and I tried to do a write-up on the case a few times, but found myself sickened by the details. But ultimately, I think it's an important case to cover, and based upon recent developments, there may actually be some measure of justice here soon. Around 3 o'clock, the observers realized the bundle was actually a human body wrapped tightly in bedding. Police were alerted, and soon authorities pulled from the river the body of a young woman. The corpse had been curled into a fetal position, enclosed in a bedspread and a terry cloth sheet, all tied securely with braided cloth belts common in Afghanistan. An umbrella base was tied to the body, likely meant to weigh it down and send it to the bottom of the river. However, the weight hadn't been enough, and the bundle stayed afloat, leading to the grim discovery. At the autopsy, forensic examiners determined the victim wasn't an adult woman as initially thought, but was approximately 16 years old. She was small and malnourished for her age, and doctors noted that her developmental stage was more typical of a 13-year-old, suggesting she had been chronically underfed. The girl had shoulder-length dark brown hair and a fair complexion. Her eye color couldn't be determined post-mortem, but her face was still in relatively recognizable condition. There was no clothing on the body, and no personal identification, absolutely nothing that immediately answered who she was. What the autopsy did reveal was a harrowing catalog of injuries, both recent and old. Disturbingly, her entire body bore evidence of prolonged and severe abuse. She had numerous scars across her legs, torso, and even her forehead. There were also multiple round burn marks on her skin, suggesting repeated disturbing acts committed against this innocent kid. One of the most telling injuries was to her left ear. The cartilage was deformed into a cauliflower ear shape, a condition usually caused by blunt trauma or constant battering, and commonly seen in pro fighters. This sadly means that she was almost certainly subject to constant hitting in this region over a prolonged period of time. Both of the girl's upper arms had been broken at some point in the past and had healed improperly, leaving her arms visibly misshapen from untreated fractures. All these old wounds had never received medical care, and they simply mended on their own, painfully and imperfectly. There were even indications of even more sinister abuse uncovered in the examination, adding another tragic dimension to the abuse she endured. The cause of the girl's death was found to be blunt force trauma to her chest and abdomen, the final brutal beating after years of torment. 2 of her ribs had been violently fractured, puncturing vital organs, and the trauma injured her lungs and spleen, which led to fatal internal bleeding. Forensic timing showed that her death likely occurred 2 or 3 days before her body was found. The perpetrators then kept her corpse for a short time and ultimately dumped her in the river, hoping she would never be found. Frankfurt police opened an investigation immediately, faced with the daunting task of identifying both the young victim and those responsible. With no name to go on, she became known in the press and case files simply as the girl from the Main, a moniker reflecting the river that carried her. Early on, investigators realized this case was highly unusual and disturbing. A teenage girl had been held and abused for years, yet no missing persons report matched her description. This suggested that whoever was responsible had kept her existence a secret from society. The items used in disposing of her body provided the first clues. The ropes binding the bundle stood out as they are commonly worn in parts of Afghanistan and Pakistan. That detail immediately led police to suspect an international dimension to the case. Perhaps the girl herself was originally from that region, or her captors were. Could she have been brought to Germany from South or Central Asia and kept hidden? It was and remains a critical line of inquiry. Investigators considered that the victim might have lived as a quote-unquote domestic servant in a household of foreign nationals from that region. In particular, one disturbing theory gained traction. The girl could have been part of a diplomat's household. If a family from the Afghanistan-Pakistan border area had come to Germany and secretly brought a child with them to work as a maid, it might explain her origins. In such a scenario, Diplomatic immunity could shield the perpetrators from scrutiny, making it extremely difficult for police to investigate them. This chilling hypothesis wasn't something the authorities took lightly, and they didn't rule it out even as they pursued all leads. The inquiry spanned well beyond Frankfurt. German authorities made efforts to reach out internationally in hopes of identifying the girl. Thousands of flyers and posters describing the victim were distributed in multiple languages across Afghanistan and parts of Pakistan. The idea was that someone in her place of origin, perhaps a relative, a neighbor, or a community member, might recognize the description of a missing girl. By the 2010s, forensic science had advanced in ways that offered new hope for cold cases like this. The German Federal Criminal Police undertook more specialized analyses of the girl's remains. Isotope analysis, a technique that examines chemical signatures in teeth and bones, provided an astonishing picture of the girl's probable life history. Scientists determined that her early childhood was likely spent in Afghanistan or Pakistan, as initially theorized. Furthermore, the isotopes suggested she came to Germany at a very young age, probably when she was about 5 years of age. The analysis indicated that for most of her time in Germany, she likely lived in a rural or semi-rural environment. Intriguingly, the chemical markers indicated that in the last roughly 2 years of her life, the girl was living in a more urban area in Germany. Frankfurt, a large city, would fit that finding, suggesting that whoever held her captive may have moved her from a countryside setting to the city not long before her death. Another major effort involved giving the girl from the Maine a face that the public could recognize. Using the remains and autopsy data, forensic artists created facial reconstructions to approximate her appearance in life. Because her skull and facial features were largely intact, they could produce a realistic image of a teenage girl with a solemn expression. By 2023, more than 2 decades had passed since the girl's body was found, but the case was far from forgotten. In fact, it became one of the focal cases in a Europe-wide initiative to solve cold cases of unidentified victims. That year, Interpol, in collaboration with national police forces, launched Operation Identify Me, a public appeal campaign to identify unidentified female victims across Western Europe. Initially, in May 2023, the campaign spotlighted 22 unsolved cases in Belgium, the Netherlands, and Germany, inviting leads from worldwide. The response was significant. Authorities received around 1,800 tips in the first phase of the campaign and managed to crack a case. In one instance, a tip even led to the identification of a decades-old victim in Belgium, giving hope that other cases could be solved as well. Encouraged by these results, the operation expanded. In October 2024, a second phase of Operation Identify Me was announced, with new cases entering the spotlight. It was at this time that this case was formally added to the campaign's lineup. Notably, it has been speculated that new DNA profiling techniques will be applied to determine where her family is. Given that she likely comes from a rural region in Afghanistan or Pakistan, it will be significantly more difficult to build out a family tree, given database availabilities. However, investigators are hopeful that other close family members have immigrated to Western countries and have had their DNA logged. While the dominant theory is that she was trafficked to Germany by diplomats, other theories have also been put forth. And trust me, these theories are perhaps even more horrifying. One theory suggests she could have been brought to Germany as part of an even darker trafficking operation to obtain young, quote-unquote, brides. International cheddar piles have been known to engage in this disgusting and heinous practice. However, this theory is speculative and hard to substantiate with the available evidence. If, however, her family can be identified, This theory may eventually be confirmed, as they may have been in on this disgusting scheme. In late 1978, authorities made a gruesome discovery beneath the suburban Chicago home of John Wayne Gacy. Gacy had slain 33 young men and teens in the 1970s and concealed most of their bodies within his property. Among the remains unearthed was Body 10, the designation given to the 10th set of remains exhumed from Gacy's crawl space on December 26, 1978. This victim's skeletal remains were found buried in the dirt under Gacy's Norwood Park Township house, alongside many others. Even by the time of discovery, the John Doe known as Body 10 had been dead long enough to be completely skeletonized. Forensic examiners determined the remains belonged to a white male estimated to be between 17 and 21 years old, and approximately 5 feet 7 inches to 5 feet 11 inches in height. Any soft tissue was long gone, so the cause of death couldn't be identified, though given the circumstances, there was no real question why he had met his end. Investigators did observe a couple of distinctive clues from the bones. The victim had once broken his left collarbone, an injury that had healed well before his death, and his teeth showed evidence of dental work such as fillings. These details suggested that this individual had a life that might be traceable. Based on the burial pattern and positions of bodies in the crawl space, police later theorized this victim was likely killed sometime in mid-1977. This made him one of Gacy's later victims before the final spree of 1978. However, at the time of the initial investigation, his exact identity and timeline remained a mystery. When Body 10 was first examined by the Cook County Medical Examiner's Office in 1979, every effort was made to identify him using the forensic techniques available at the time. Because the remains were skeletal, unsurprisingly, fingerprints couldn't be obtained, but forensic dentists charted the victim's teeth in detail. Dental records were one of the main tools in 1970s forensic identification, so investigators compared Body 10's dental characteristics against missing persons reports. To aid identification, experts created a clay forensic facial reconstruction from the skull. Despite these efforts, in the first year after Gacy's arrest, the authorities were unable to put a name to Body 10. By March 1979, Gacy had been charged with 33 slayings, and eventually 28 of those victims were identified by name. The remaining victims, including Body 10, were left as John Doe cases, known only by the numbers assigned when their bodies were recovered. The police publicized descriptions of the unidentified victims in the hope that someone would recognize a missing friend or family member. In the case of Body 10, no match was made. After Gacy's trial in 1980, the unidentified remains, including Body 10, were interred in local cemeteries. Crucially, while DNA testing wasn't available at the time, it was a technology that was known to be on what then seemed like a distant horizon. From the beginning, detectives generated a list of young men who went missing in the mid-1970s and could potentially be Body 10. Over the years, numerous leads emerged. Families who wondered if their long-lost son or brother had fallen prey to Gacy and might correspond to one of the unidentified bodies. Some of these leads seemed promising, but ultimately didn't pan out as investigators hoped. For example, one candidate was Michael D. Mansfield, a 19-year-old who disappeared from Rolling Meadows, Illinois on New Year's Eve, 1975. Mansfield fit the general profile, a Midwestern teen who vanished in roughly the right time frame, and for a time was suspected as a Gacy victim. Decades later, however, a separate deathbed confession implicated someone else in Mansfield's disappearance. A number of other theories have been investigated, but every result had thus far been a dead end. Over time, a few more speculative theories arose. One theory even suggested that Body 10 might have been an earlier victim than initially believed. Under this theory, he was possibly slain as far back as 1972, making him one of Gacy's first victims chronologically. This idea stemmed from Gacy's own statements. Gacy once claimed that his second victim was buried in the crawl space near the first victim's remains. Because Body 10's grave in the crawl space was relatively close to where Gacy's first victim was buried, some wondered if Body 10 could actually be that mysterious second victim. However, prosecutors at Gacy's trial doubted this timeline, believing that he likely had no victims from 1972 to 1975 while his wife was living in the house. In any case, no solid clues to this individual's name emerged in the original investigation, and the case languished for decades with little new information. For decades, the identities of John Wayne Gacy's unnamed victims remained frustratingly elusive. In 2011, Cook County Sheriff Tom Dart launched a groundbreaking initiative. He hoped to harness advanced DNA technology to finally solve mysteries that traditional methods and earlier DNA testing had failed to unravel. The sheriff's team carefully exhumed 8 unidentified victims, as well as extract DNA from the remains that had initially remained unburied and preserved. These samples were sent to the University of North Texas Center for Human Identification, a lab specializing in challenging forensic cases. This initiative led to numerous breakthroughs, with 3 cases being solved over the next decade. The most recent identification came in 2021, with a then remarkable use of forensic genetic genealogy. Victim 5 was identified as Francis Wayne Alexander, a North Carolina native whose family connections were pieced together with the assistance of the DNA Doe Project. Thanks to these efforts, what had once been 8 unnamed victims was reduced to 5 remaining unidentified victims. Body 10 is one of those 5 who still await identification. In a 2023 interview, Sheriff Dart revealed that his team has at least one promising lead they're following, though he warned nothing is certain yet. Today, nearly 50 years after the John Doe known only as Body 10 was pulled from that crawl space, he remains unnamed, but not forgotten. Investigators emphasize that he was someone's son, friend, and possibly brother, and they're determined to reunite his remains with a name and family. I hope to have an update on this case in the near future, since I strongly suspect that this will be yet another case which is solved through the use of genetic genealogy. On July 7, 1994, a group of hikers made a grim discovery at a remote campsite area known as Windy Point in Montrose County, Colorado. While exploring an area about 25 miles west of the town of Montrose, they came across a human skull and jawbone lying on the ground. Shocked by the find, the hikers collected the skull and jaw in a container to protect them from scavenging animals, and left a note for authorities before hiking out for help. The next day, a forest ranger and a sheriff's detective returned to the site with the hiking group. As they searched the area, they found more human remains scattered around, including portions of a spine, a shoulder blade, and an upper arm bone. Investigators recovered a piece of a woman's black vinyl belt near the bones, the only item of clothing or personal effect found at the scene. There was, in essence, no trace of any identification beyond the skeleton itself. Given the remote location and the condition of the remains, authorities immediately suspected foul play. A local medical examiner conducted a forensic examination of the remains, which yielded several clues about the victim. The remains were of a white female, estimated to be between 35 and 45 years old, approximately 5 feet 4 inches to 5 feet 7 inches tall, with reddish-brown hair. Examination of the skull and bones noted 2 distinctive medical conditions. The woman had suffered from TMJ syndrome, a jaw disorder, and showed signs of scoliosis, a curvature of the spine. These health details, though not particularly rare or even uncommon, were hoped to help identify her if matching medical records or descriptions could be found. Investigators also paid close attention to the victim's teeth. Several teeth had been removed by a dentist during her life, and notably, one molar had a gold crown, and another tooth had a full gold restoration. Unfortunately, after checking her dentals against databases of missing persons and known dental records at the time, no match was immediately found. Notably, the condition of the remains made determining an exact cause of death impossible, as there was no obvious trauma that was evident on the bones. However, the fact that the body appeared to have been dumped with no clothing except a belt strongly suggested this hadn't been an accident. Investigators theorized that the woman had been slain somewhere else and her body deliberately disposed of at the Windy Point site. Based on decomposition, authorities suspected she had been left there in late 1993, perhaps in the fall, meaning she might have been dead for several months before the discovery. Montrose County Sheriff's investigators eventually dubbed the unknown victim the Windy Point Jane Doe for the location where she was found. From the start, the biggest challenge was identifying the victim. Investigators pored over missing persons reports from Colorado and neighboring states, looking for a woman whose age, description, and dental work might match the Windy Point Jane Doe. As months turned into years, no one stepped forward to report a person matching the description, an unusual situation that left investigators with little to go on. In 1995, as part of their efforts to generate leads, the authorities sent the unknown woman's skull to a forensic institute in Washington, D.C. During this time, a forensic artist created a rather unique facial reconstruction, which you're probably going to want to look at right now if you don't value your ability to sleep. The resulting clay model was photographed, and a sketch of the approximate face was widely circulated to the public by the sheriff's office. The hope was that someone might recognize the woman's face, though as you can see, the results of this reconstruction were definitely questionable to say the least. That said, the uncanny nature of the reconstruction definitely attracted attention to the case, which otherwise wouldn't have attracted that much media coverage. Unfortunately, despite media attention and distribution of the reconstructed image, no solid leads emerged from it, and the Jane Doe's identity remained a mystery. By the late 2010s, forensic technology had advanced dramatically. Techniques such as DNA profiling and genetic genealogy, which were not options in 1994, started to crack cold cases that had languished for years. In the Windy Point case, the remains had been deemed too decomposed for traditional DNA identification back in the 90s. However, in 2020, Montrose County investigators decided to take a fresh look at extracting DNA from the Jane Doe's remains. This was enabled thanks to new methods that could work with old degraded samples. Evidence from the remains would be submitted to the Colorado Bureau of Investigation for advanced analysis in August 2020. The CBI's Cold Case and Forensic Lab Division had begun employing forensic genetic genealogy. This process can identify an unknown person by locating relatives in DNA databases and building out a family tree. The Sheriff's Office and CBI obtained a DNA sample from the Jane Doe's remains and uploaded the genetic profile for comparison, hoping to find any familial connections. For nearly 2 years, specialists worked on the case behind the scenes. They also re-examined the victim's dental information alongside the DNA data, ensuring that if a potential identity was found, it could be confirmed with the distinctive dental records on file. In April 2022, the persistence paid off, and the Sheriff of Montrose County received an eagerly awaited call from the CBI. The DNA profile of the Windy Point Jane Doe had matched to family members associated with a missing persons report from 1993. Nearly 28 years after the remains were found, investigators finally learned Jane Doe's real name, Susan Elizabeth Hops. Susan Hops was a 45-year-old woman who had been reported missing from Pierce County, Washington on August 9, 1993. She fit the general profile investigators had established. Her age, physical description, and even details like her dental work aligned with the Jane Doe. With the identification of Susan Hops, the nearly 30-year-old mystery of her identity was solved. This breakthrough also transformed the investigation. It was no longer a hunt for a name, but now a hunt for a perpetrator as well. Montrose County authorities announced that, based on the circumstances, Susan Hops's death would continue to be investigated as a slaying. Notably, officials pointed out that Hops had no known ties to Colorado, reinforcing the theory that she did not end up at Windy Point on her own. Detectives from Montrose County immediately began collaborating with law enforcement in Washington state to retrace Susan's last known activities and contacts. Despite having been identified for quite some time, the tragic circumstances around Susan Hops' passing still remains unknown. At present, there haven't been any further developments noted in her case, though her case is an active and ongoing investigation. Notably, she was last seen leaving her home in Washington state in the company of two individuals. Little more has been publicly released at this point, and her case hasn't received much significant attention beyond the uncanny nature of her clay facial reconstruction. On the cold morning of December 6, 1983, a Niagara Mohawk power truck driver made a shocking find along Route 17 in the town of Ellery in Chautauqua County, New York. In a drainage ditch near the highway lay the body of a woman, face up and partially clothed, with no purse, shoes, jewelry, or any form of identification. Authorities determined the victim was a white female around 30 to 37 years old, approximately 5 feet 4 inches tall and 125 pounds, with brown eyes. She had been beaten and also shot 4 times, twice in the chest, once in the back, and once in the face. The injuries, including damage to her skull from the beating, suggested a very personal and violent attack. With no name to call her, investigators labeled the unknown victim the Chautauqua County Jane Doe, and the search for her identity and the perpetrator began. From the outset, law enforcement officials struggled to identify the woman. No local missing person reports matched her description. An examination by a forensic anthropologist in Buffalo uncovered intriguing clues that hinted the victim may not have been from the area. The woman's clothing included high-quality, expensive pieces from Europe. For instance, a plaid wool trench coat and a white V-neck shirt were both Italian or German produced, and not sold in the States. She also wore a handmade skirt which likely also came from Europe. Her dental work was similarly telling. She had gold fillings indicating expensive European-style dental care. Perhaps most striking, the victim was found to have an IUD for birth control that was foreign-made and, at the time, available only in Canada and parts of Europe. These findings strongly suggested that the woman had ties outside the country, possibly in Western Europe or Canada. Investigators also noted evidence that strongly suggested she had given birth about 15 years prior. One physical clue puzzled investigators more than any other: a single handwritten note found in the victim's coat pocket. The note was on stationery from the Blue Bay Motor Hotel, a motel in Vancouver, British Columbia, on Canada's west coast. On it were 3 lines of letters and 5-digit numbers, scrawled in a barely legible form. The letters appeared to be abbreviations or shorthand, and the numbers were written as 24233, 68301, and 74261. At the time, police hoped this cryptic note meant the woman had stayed at the motel, which could lead to a guest registry and a real name. They obtained motel receipts from October through December 1983 to check for anyone resembling Jane Doe. However, Given the vast distance between Vancouver, Canada, and Chautauqua County, New York, any stay could have been weeks or months before the slaying, and no clear link was found. To this day, the exact meaning of the motel note remains unclear. It may reference airline phone numbers, map coordinates, or something else entirely. Still, its presence provided strong circumstantial evidence, which indicated a connection between the victim or perpetrator and a journey that involved Western Canada. Throughout the late 1980s and 1990s, the case remained stubbornly cold, despite numerous efforts. Investigators enlisted the help of the FBI and even Interpol to run the victim's fingerprints, but no identification was made. Details of the case were published in a variety of trade magazines for detectives in the US, Canada, Italy, and a few other European countries, in hopes of generating leads. The few leads that did emerge led to dead ends. One theory considered early on was that Jane Doe might have been traveling with a long-haul truck driver. One witness reported seeing a woman of her description at a nearby truck stop the day before the slaying. On this basis, investigators thought she could have been hitchhiking or riding eastward with someone. However, nothing concrete ever tied a specific person or vehicle to the crime. Over the years, a few individuals came forward with claims or tips, but none panned out. In one instance, an inmate in Oklahoma, already serving a life sentence for other violent crimes, confessed to slaying the woman, providing details that initially seemed credible. Detectives traveled to interview him, only to determine he was a fraud who had learned about the case from a magazine and was seeking attention. In another case, a woman in California contacted police, claiming the victim was her missing friend from Toronto, the largest city in Canada. An investigator even went to Toronto to follow up, but no evidence was found to substantiate the claim. Despite theories that the victim might have been involved in some criminal activity, no evidence ever indicated this, and nothing explained why she was in Chautauqua County. Then the leads simply stopped, and the case went cold for almost 4 decades, with virtually no developments whatsoever. One tip in early 2021 pointed to a missing woman from Montreal, Canada, named Elizabeth Zita, who had vanished in October 1981. Zita's age and timeline seemed to align with Jane Doe, especially since she was from outside the U.S. In response, investigators coordinated with Montreal police and obtained DNA from Zita's daughter for comparison. Hopes were dashed when the DNA test came back negative. Investigators then turned to cutting-edge forensic techniques to develop new leads. By 2021, the FBI agreed to assist by using forensic genetic genealogy. Jane Doe's DNA was submitted to specialized genealogy labs to find potential familial matches. The genetic markers indicated the woman likely had roots in the Netherlands, Belgium, or Western Germany. This finding affirmed what investigators had long suspected from the physical evidence, that this Jane Doe was probably European. Armed with that knowledge, the team began reaching out to law enforcement and media in those countries, hoping to find a missing person report or family that might match the victim. At the same time, authorities revisited the physical evidence with fresh eyes. A new forensic artist's sketch was produced in 2022, incorporating new details and producing a more lifelike sketch. This updated illustration presented her as a petite woman with wavy brown hair and dark eyes, distinct from older, less accurate sketches. Investigators also re-examined the note from the motel. They now believe the scribbled information could reference airline flights, or perhaps be a coded reference to Canadian phone numbers. That said this evidence is still very much open for interpretation, so if you have a credible theory on it, reach out directly to the authorities. If someone could figure out exactly what this reference is, it would be a major breakthrough in the case. In 2023, a further boost came from an independent source. A missing persons awareness organization created lifelike digital images of this Jane Doe, using her post-mortem photographs as a base to show what she might have looked like alive. And yes, if you're just listening, this is one of those times you'll want to look at your screen for a moment. At present, the case appears to be making headway for the first time in decades, and I suspect that familial DNA will be able to at least solve the mystery of this woman's identity. Once her identity is solved and returned to her, this may cause a torrent of clues to come forth regarding how she actually perished. It also may give some context to the coded messages on the notepad, which may help the authorities figure out what precisely the writings mean. In October 1997, a person walking through a wooded area near the small town of Wilkson in Washington state made a grim discovery: a set of human skeletal remains. The remains were found off a rural stretch of Gale Creek Road, about 9 miles from Wilkson School and just south of the town of Buckley. In the remote, dense woods, roughly a 45-minute drive from Seattle, it was clear the body had lain hidden for some time. Detectives from the Pierce County Sheriff's Office responded to the scene, but the immediate investigation yielded few clues about who the victim was or how she had died. Authorities determined the remains belonged to a female, roughly 5 feet 5 inches tall, and likely between 20 and 50 years old. Her skeletal remains were fully clothed, and she was wearing a distinctive long-sleeve sweatshirt emblazoned with the words Pacific Lutheran University. These personal items provided strong circumstantial evidence that the woman had ties to the local area, as Pacific Lutheran University is located in Tacoma. The authorities searched missing person reports and contacted local campuses, believing she may be a student, yet no immediate leads surfaced. It seemed as if this woman had simply vanished into the woods without anyone knowing. Forensic examiners noted a few distinctive features on the remains. The woman had suffered a number of serious injuries during her life that had healed by the time of her death. She had a previously broken right thigh bone that had healed in a way that left her right leg slightly shorter than her left, a condition that may have caused a noticeable limp. She also bore evidence of past trauma to her jaw. A fracture of the lower jaw had been treated with surgical wiring, and some of her teeth were missing or had dental work. These healed injuries were unusual markers. In theory, they could have been key to identifying her if dental records or hospital records matched someone. Despite these potentially identifying characteristics, the investigators hit a dead end. No matching dental records were found, and crucially, no missing person report appeared to correspond to this unknown woman. With no identification and no immediate evidence of what caused the woman's passing, the case grew cold. There were no obvious signs of acute trauma, and without a name or background, investigators couldn't say whether she died from an accident, exposure, or foul play. Still, the circumstances, a relatively young woman found deceased in the woods, were suspicious enough that detectives treated the case with concern. Over the years, officials made periodic efforts to identify the Jane Doe. In 2009, more than a decade after the body was found, her details were entered into the NamUs database. This database is a nationwide repository meant to match unidentified remains with missing persons cases. The entry included her physical description, DNA profile, dental information, and descriptions of her clothing and healed injuries. An artistic forensic reconstruction of her face was also created in hopes that someone might recognize her. By the 2020s, advances in forensic science offered new hope for long unsolved cases like this one. In late 2023, the Pierce County Sheriff's Office decided to take a fresh approach to their Jane Doe case using cutting-edge DNA technology. They submitted preserved biological evidence from the 1997 remains to Othram. As you may be aware, Othram is known for its work in forensic genetic genealogy, a technique that goes beyond standard DNA profiling by constructing a person's genetic family tree. The goal was ambitious. If they could build a detailed DNA profile of the unknown woman, they might link her to relatives and finally discover her name. Othram's scientists were able to extract a viable DNA sample from the decades-old remains and perform what they call forensic-grade genome sequencing. This process decoded a comprehensive map of the woman's genetic markers. It was a painstaking process, involving months of genealogical research and cooperation from family members who were likely surprised to learn of a long-lost relative. Finally, in early April 2025, the decades-old mystery was solved. The once anonymous victim was conclusively identified as Lori Craig, born December 17, 1959. After 27 years of anonymity, Pierce County's Jane Doe had her name back. When authorities announced Lori Craig's name in April 2025, they also began to piece together the story of her life and the circumstances of her disappearance. Lori was in her mid-30s at the time she went missing in the mid-1990s. She was a local resident of Pierce County, Washington, but surprisingly little is known about her personal life. At the time of her disappearance, Lori was married to a man named Ronald Martin, who was a few years her senior. According to official records, Lori was last confirmed alive in January 1996. Sometime after that point, she vanished. Strikingly, as law enforcement later noted, no one filed a missing person report when Lori went missing, not her husband, nor any immediate family. This fact has raised extreme suspicion amongst investigators and amongst online true crime communities. Whatever the reason, the lack of a missing persons report meant Lori's name was never entered into databases back in 1996. Thus, no one connected her to the Jane Doe found in 1997. Identifying Lori Craig was a huge step forward, but it was only the beginning of a new chapter in this cold case. With her identity known, the Pierce County Sheriff's Office announced that they were officially investigating Lori's death as an intentional slaying. Now that the case has turned into a different kind of investigation, detectives are retracing Lori's footsteps in the mid-1990s. They're trying to construct a timeline of her life leading up to her disappearance in January 1996. In particular, investigators are looking closely at the people in Lori's life at that time. Foremost among them, her late husband, Ronald Martin. Notably, Ronald Martin died in 2020 of natural causes, meaning he's of course not around to answer questions or shed light on what happened to Lori. Police have not publicly named him or anyone else as a suspect, and they emphasize that they have not determined who is responsible yet. However, it has not gone unnoticed that the one person who would have been expected to report Lori missing, her spouse, never did so. On the night of September 11, 2005, traffic at a busy intersection in Stanton, California, was disrupted by a sudden tragedy. A young woman dashed across the street against a red light and was struck by a car at around 9 p.m. near the corner of Beach Boulevard and Orangewood Avenue. The impact was severe, and paramedics rushed the gravely injured pedestrian to West Anaheim Medical Center, where despite their efforts, she was pronounced dead shortly afterward. She carried no identification, and in the aftermath of the accident, this woman remained entirely unknown. Authorities would come to refer to her only as the Stanton Jane Doe, the nameless victim of a fatal accident who left behind many clues but no clear identity. Investigators at the scene noted that the young woman appeared to be in her late teens or 20s. Her face was intact and recognizable despite the trauma, giving hope that someone might identify her. Yet no witnesses or personal documents could tell responders who she was. As police began their work, the immediate priority, beyond tending to the accident, became unraveling the mystery of this Jane Doe's identity. Who was this woman, and why had no one come forward to claim her? The official investigation kicked off that very night in 2005, setting in motion a case that remains unsolved to this day. From the outset, detectives gathered every available clue from the young woman's person and the accident scene. Forensic examiners documented her physical characteristics in detail. She was around 5 feet 3 inches tall and 165 pounds, with long, wavy black or brown hair and brown eyes. Perhaps the most telling clues were the clothing and personal belongings found with the Stanton Jane Doe. She was fully dressed in casual attire, suggesting she had been out and about that day. Notably, she wore a black tank top emblazoned with the words, "Baby Girl," in sequins, along with a white striped shirt over it. Over her outfit, she carried a distinctive jacket bearing the word New York on the front and NY Black Yankees on one sleeve. On her wrists, she wore several silver bangle bracelets. All of these items were carefully collected by the coroner. Inside the small black purse she had been carrying, investigators found more intriguing evidence. Tucked in her purse was a one-day bus pass for Orange County Bus Route 38, dated September 11, 2005, the very day of the accident. The bus pass appeared to have been purchased in the city of Norwalk, in Los Angeles County. There were also several shopping receipts from stores at the Buena Park Mall, a nearby shopping center, all time-stamped on the afternoon of September 11, 2005. In fact, records show she made purchases that day. One receipt from a shoe store around 5:30 for $70, and another from a clothing store around 6 p.m. for a jacket. Finally, in her purse was a damaged CD containing a compilation of reggaeton songs from 2005. Investigators noted that this is a musical genre with roots in Puerto Rico and Latin America, possibly another hint toward her cultural background. Each of these belongings, the bus ticket, the receipts, the CD, painted a partial picture of the Jane Doe's final day. She had likely spent the afternoon shopping and then taken a bus that evening, ending up on foot in Stanton. But none of these clues, as useful as they were for tracing her steps, immediately answered the core question: her name. Forensic evidence was also collected in hopes of a future identification. The coroner took the woman's fingerprints and DNA samples and preserved her dental records. Her fingerprints were run through law enforcement databases, but yielded no match to any known missing person or criminal record. DNA was uploaded to national unidentified persons databases, likewise with no immediate result. A dental examination suggested she was in her early 20s, with one forensic dentist estimating an age range of roughly 21 to 26 years based on her teeth. All this data was entered into official databases like Name Us, in the hope that eventually a match would emerge. Despite these efforts, in the initial investigation in 2005, no leads to her identity surfaced. It seemed she had not been reported missing at the time, and nothing about her fingerprints or DNA had a prior record on file. The case grew cold, and the Stanton Jane Doe was laid to rest in a county cemetery, her headstone lacking her name. Although the trail was initially cold, authorities did not close the book on the Stanton Jane Doe. Over the years, the Orange County Sheriff's Department and Coroner's Office periodically revisited the case, hoping new techniques or information might provide a breakthrough. They compared her profile against countless missing persons reports from California and across the country. By 2013, 8 years after the accident, investigators had formally ruled out almost 150 different missing women as being this Jane Doe. In October of the same year, as the 8th anniversary of the incident passed, Orange County officials made a renewed public push to identify the unknown woman. They released a forensic sketch of her face to the media, hoping it might jog someone's memory. The sketch depicted a youthful woman with curly hair and a gentle expression, based on morgue photographs and the coroner's observations. In parallel with the official investigation, the Stanton Jane Doe case has drawn the attention of amateur sleuths and true crime followers on the internet. Over the years, various public theories and speculation have emerged as people try to piece together who this young woman might have been. One popular line of reasoning is that the woman may have been a visitor from out of the area, possibly from the East Coast or Caribbean. Enthusiasts point to the NY Black Yankees jacket and the reggaeton music CD as cultural clues. Some have speculated that she could have been of either Puerto Rican or Dominican descent. This is based on the combination of her physical appearance, New York branded clothing, and Latin music. If she was from out of town, some have speculated that she may have been staying in a local hotel. If this theory were true, perhaps no family reported her missing, because her relatives were in another state or even country, completely unaware of the tragedy. Additionally, some have noted that jaywalking across a wide California boulevard, as she did, might be something a person from out of state would misjudge. People familiar with both Los Angeles and NYC have speculated that a local Angelino likely would have known not to jaywalk at the time and place she did. And, full disclosure here, I ended up going down a bit of a rabbit hole on the jaywalking culture in both cities. In NYC, where I've been and personally jaywalked on numerous occasions, I've seen people pull stunts in traffic which I considered extremely risky, like it was absolutely nothing to them. For any fans of Seinfeld out there, I'm reminded of the scene where George tries to jaywalk a Frogger machine across the street, with disastrous results. I'm much less personally familiar with LA, but according to my research, fast vehicles and very wide streets make it genuinely dangerous to jaywalk. Further, the LAPD had historically been very harsh in imposing stiff financial penalties associated with jaywalking, unlike in NYC, where the cops are very lax about it. Others have speculated that she was a local or recent transplant to the area who may have been estranged from her family. Some have speculated that given the limited amount of belongings carried on her, that this speaks to her being a local resident. Personally, I think this could just as easily support the theory that she left her ID in her hotel or motel while she went out. Others have speculated that she wasn't reported missing because she was living a transient lifestyle. This theory doesn't suggest she was living on the streets, but rather that she may have been bouncing around between homes of friends and acquaintances. As such, her disappearance may not have been noted in any meaningful way, and whoever she was staying with may have just thought she had moved on. On May 31st, 1995, at 10:45 in the evening, a young dark-haired woman walked into the lobby of Oslo's prestigious Plaza Hotel. She checked in under the name Jennifer Fairgate, claiming to be 21 and from Belgium. The receptionist noted her confident, elegant demeanor and overlooked protocol by not requesting a passport or credit card. Jennifer was dressed in stylish black clothing and carried only a small travel bag. She mentioned a companion named Lois Fairgate, but this person never showed up. With no identification or payment on file, the woman proceeded to room 2805 and was effectively anonymous. The Plaza Hotel, one of the tallest and most luxurious in Norway, often catered to diplomats and other VIPs. In this grand yet impersonal setting, an unsettling mystery was about to unfold. On the 28th floor, Jennifer Fairgate kept to herself. Staff recalled that she spoke English and German with no noticeable accent, but they reported that she seemed reclusive, and they barely saw her. She ordered room service, tipping generously in cash, and otherwise hung a "Do Not Disturb" sign on her door. Over the next 2 days, she remained practically invisible to everyone around her. On the night of June 2nd, A room service attendant delivered dinner to the mystery woman's room. Jennifer accepted her meal with a polite nod and left a generous tip. There was no hint that she was in any distress whatsoever. Little did the hotel staff know that this was the last time anyone would see this woman alive. By the evening of June 3rd, the hotel grew worried about the unpaid bill for the room. A staff member was sent to contact Jennifer, but got no response and saw the Do Not Disturb sign still on the door. A security guard arrived around 7:50 p.m. and knocked firmly, announcing himself. He was met with a sudden, muffled shot from inside the room. The guard was startled and hurried to fetch the head of security. During that time, he left the room unattended for about 15 minutes, a crucial period of time that will later factor into why this is such a bizarre mystery. When they managed to open the door, they found Jennifer Fairgate slumped on the bed, with a single shot to her forehead. She held a warm weapon loosely in her hand, and the room's door had been double locked from the inside. It appeared at first that she had done it herself, but later forensic results would question whether this was actually the case. That said, by the time the room was unlocked, no other person was present, and the scene was eerily quiet. Detectives scoured the room for evidence of the woman's identity and what had happened, but they found almost nothing. No passport, no wallet, no keys or personal papers were in the room. The woman had brought very few belongings, and those she did bring offered no clues. All the labels had been meticulously cut out of her clothes, denying police any hint of where her garments came from. The bathroom held no toiletries, not even a toothbrush, makeup, or hairbrush. The only items of note were the weapon and a black briefcase filled with ammo. Hotel phone records later showed she had attempted to dial 2 international numbers, both in Belgium, during her stay, but those calls were to non-existent lines. The weapon found in her hand had its serial number partially filed off, making it untraceable. Every sign pointed to a deliberate effort to erase any trail of who this supposed Jennifer Fairgate really was. Standard forensic tests turned up few meaningful leads. The woman's fingerprints and DNA were collected and circulated via Interpol, but no matches were found in any criminal or missing person database. It was confirmed that the name and address she provided were false. For example, the Belgian address she had given didn't exist. There was no evidence that any Lois or other companion had ever been in the room. Only her fingerprints were found. The autopsy revealed that the fatal blast was fired with the weapon pressed against her head. Curiously, lab tests found no gunshot residue on her hands, an unusual result if she had fired the weapon herself. No alcohol was detected in her blood, and while other toxicology screening was limited, there was no sign of common substances. In fact, the coroner noted that her stomach contents suggested she had died many hours before the security guard ever knocked, a baffling discrepancy in the timeline. She appeared to be in her mid-20s and stood around 5'2", with short dark hair and blue eyes. She had expensive dental work indicating what was likely at least a middle-class upbringing in a place with high-quality dentistry. Given all the facts, the Norwegian authorities thought that she would be identified rapidly. Despite international alerts and widespread media coverage, no family or friend ever came forward to identify her. Norwegian newspapers dubbed her the Plaza Hotel Woman, the mysterious guest who died alone in a high-rise hotel. After months of investigation, the police had no suspects and not even a real name for the victim. In 1996, authorities reluctantly ruled the death a probable self-deletion and closed the case, though they publicly stated they couldn't be entirely sure due to the forensic oddities. In line with routine procedure for those sorts of cases in Norway, much of the physical evidence was eventually destroyed after the case closed, making future re-examination impossible. The unknown woman was quietly buried in Oslo under a simple gravestone, her identity still a mystery. Over the years, several theories have been proposed to explain Jennifer Fairgate's fate and who she was in life. Some speculate that Jennifer might have gone to extreme lengths to die anonymously, traveling under an alias and removing personal traces so no loved ones would be notified. However, no note was found, and it's highly unusual for a young person planning such a thing to obtain an untraceable weapon, especially in Europe where this isn't so easy to do. Further, the lack of residue on her hands was viewed as very unusual by investigators. These oddities make the theory that she did it herself far from straightforward, even if it's the theory preferred by investigators. Another theory is that she was slain, and the scene was staged. In this scenario, an unknown perpetrator, perhaps the mysterious Lois or someone she met, could have been let into the room, ended her, and then slipped out before security returned. The missing residue and the untraceable weapon lend credence to this idea. As the guard left to get help, the door was unwatched for about 15 minutes, a window in which the perpetrator might have escaped unseen. In this scenario, there were also no signs of forced entry, suggesting Jennifer likely opened the door for the individual. Notably, security cameras weren't ubiquitous at the time, making the hallway essentially unmonitored. Yet no clear evidence of any other person was ever found, making the theory difficult to prove. The most intriguing speculation is that Jennifer Fairgate was involved in espionage. Everything about her clandestine stay, the false identity, lack of personal items, and choice of a hotel frequented by VIPs, fits the profile of an intelligence operative. Some experts noted that her methods of maintaining anonymity resembled classic techniques taught to spies. Perhaps she was on a secret mission and was eliminated because of what she knew. Under this theory, her death could have been part of a covert operation. This would also potentially explain why she spoke English and German at a native level and without any discernible accent. It would also explain why no one ever claimed her body. If she was a spy, any agency she worked for would deny knowledge of her. Further, her family may have been informed that she had fallen in the line of duty and to not seek or respond to any further questioning on the matter. Decades later, the true identity of the woman known as Jennifer Fairgate, the Oslo Plaza woman, and the exact circumstances of her death remain unsolved. The case stayed mostly dormant until a Norwegian investigative journalist pushed for her body to be exhumed in 2016 for fresh forensic analysis. Isotope tests on her teeth and advanced DNA profiling suggested she likely spent her early life in Central Europe, possibly Germany, and was a few years older than the age she had given. Even so, her DNA hasn't matched any known individual in any international database. Like many cases such as this, the most obvious next step would be to conduct genetic genealogy testing and try to reconstruct her family tree. However, if the espionage theory is true, it may explain why this hasn't happened yet. On August 11, 1994, a fishing trawler was in a river north of Sydney in Australia when it brought in the most disturbing catch possible. The net snagged a metal cross frame wrapped in plastic, which was initially assumed to simply be debris. One of the fishermen hauled the cumbersome steel frame onto his deck and immediately noticed the bag had what looked to be a bone sticking out. When he looked closer and saw more bones inside, he realized it was a human body and alerted the cops immediately. When police and forensic experts examined the haul, the full horror became clear. The victim had literally been crucified onto the improvised metal rack, his arms outstretched on a T-shaped frame. The steel cross, roughly 6 feet long, appeared professionally welded to fit the man's body, and it was so heavy that likely more than one person was needed to dump it in the river. In fact, the authorities speculated a group of strong men would have been required to toss it in, suggesting many people knew about this disturbing act. This grotesque setup earned the unknown victim a grim nickname in the press, the Rack Man. From the outset, identifying the body proved difficult. The remains had likely been submerged for 6 to 12 months, leaving what was left of the man very badly decomposed. A forensic pathologist in Sydney determined that the victim was male, of European descent, relatively short in stature, and possibly in his 30s. He had been slain by a blunt force blow to the head, though it was unclear if he was tied to the frame before or after this event. The body's fingerprints had dissolved from prolonged water exposure, and the man's teeth had no fillings or distinctive dental work to aid identification. None of these clues matched any missing person reports, leaving the victim a mystery. Detectives next looked at the victim's clothing for clues to his identity. He wore a medium-size, everything Australian polo shirt and no-sweat tracksuit pants, which are or were apparently common Australian brands. Aside from that, it appeared that there was simply nothing left that could conclusively identify the man. Notably, forensic DNA technology wasn't sufficiently advanced at the time to exact a usable profile, but thankfully the authorities preserved his remains for later use. With Rackman still unidentified, New South Wales police turned to public appeals and forensic artistry. The forensic creation was widely circulated, and the case was featured on Australia's Most Wanted. Tips flooded in, with numerous individuals believing he looked like various organized crime figures, but all these tips came to nothing. Nearly 24 years after the body's discovery, a breakthrough finally came. By 2018, DNA technology had advanced enough to extract a usable genetic profile from the degraded remains. In August 2018, the New South Wales coroner announced that the Rack Man had been positively identified as Max Tankevsky. He was a 36-year-old Sydney man who had vanished in early 1993. Tankevsky had in fact been on the police's list of possible matches early on, but in the 1990s there was no way to confirm it. Now modern forensics finally put a name to the unknown victim, ending a quarter-century-old mystery about his identity. The identification shed light on the victim's backstory. Max Tankevsky had been a missing person since 1993. He was last seen on January 11, 1993, leaving his home in Sydney, reportedly embarking on a big gambling trip. A habitual gambler, Tankevsky often traveled along Australia's east coast to visit casinos and racetracks, though he usually returned home within a few days. In January 1993, this routine journey proved fatal, and Tankevsky never came back. His family reported him missing when he failed to return, but for the next 25 years, they heard nothing of Max. Police had opened a missing persons case for Tankevsky in 1993, but with no leads, it too went cold alongside the unidentified body case. Despite the violent end to his life, Max Tankevsky was not known as a violent or criminal figure himself, and by all accounts his only notable habit was gambling. One theory floated by crime analysts is that Tankevsky accumulated debts or crossed a dangerous loan shark while gambling, leading to a deadly retaliation. But this remains pure speculation in the absence of hard evidence. That said, the elaborate and excessive method by which he was eliminated, literally strapping the victim to a metal crucifix, seemed like it could be intended as a warning to others. Given that all evidence suggests that Tankevsky was a gambling addict, I personally suspect that the loan shark theory is correct. Notably, the case has once again gone cold, indicating that turning up his identity didn't lead to the answers investigators were hoping for. If he had crossed a mobbed-up loan shark, this may explain why nobody is willing to talk about what happened in his last days. I suspect that if the two cases had been connected earlier, a forensic accountant may have been able to provide some serious insights into this case. That said, given the passage of time, I suspect records had already been destroyed, and it was too late. Again, though, that's just speculation on my part. On a warm spring afternoon in 1984, a property owner in southwest Cobb County, Georgia, made a grim discovery. It was May 10th, 1984, when he stumbled upon skeletal human remains lying in a bed of pine straw in a wooded area near the Chattahoochee River. Weeds and undergrowth had partially covered the bones, suggesting the body had been there for some time. The shocked individual contacted authorities immediately, and by 3 p.m. that day, Cobb County police officers had arrived at the scene. Little did they know, this would begin a decades-long mystery of the unidentified woman now known only as the Cobb County Jane Doe. Police cordoned off the wooded area as investigators combed the scene for clues. Early observations indicated the remains were those of a young woman. The Cobb County medical examiner was called in to examine the remains on site. It was evident the body was in a skeletal state, meaning most soft tissue had decomposed, but some things could be determined. The examiner determined the victim was a white female, likely between 18 and 25 years old, standing approximately 5'5". Her weight was less clear, though he estimated that she would have likely been between 105 and 135 pounds in life. The medical examiner also determined that she had been dead for a number of months, and that she had likely perished sometime in 1983. Due to the circumstances and condition of the remains, the death was immediately deemed suspicious. The medical examiner ultimately ruled that she had been slain, even though the exact cause couldn't be determined from the skeletal remains. As investigators gathered evidence, they noted several unusual attributes about the victim. Notably, her skeleton showed signs of serious past injuries and medical treatment. She had undergone major reconstructive surgery to the right side of her face at some point before her death. A plastic orbital plate had been implanted to repair her right eye socket. The damage was severe enough that detectives later speculated it might have been the result of a severe punch or other blunt trauma from an earlier incident. Additionally, her left ankle had once been broken and surgically mended. A metal pin still reinforced that ankle bone. Even her footwear gave a clue. The woman wore an orthopedic insert in her left boot, likely to compensate for the old ankle injury. These healed injuries told a subtle story of someone who had been hurt badly in the past and received significant medical care. Investigators hoped that such distinctive medical history, a repaired eye socket and ankle, might one day help identify her if medical records or family recollections surfaced. Beyond the bones themselves, detectives collected a number of personal items and clothing fragments from the scene. The victim's attire provided both puzzling clues and poignant hints about her life. On or near the remains, officers found a mix of women's and men's clothing. The woman was wearing a light blue short-sleeved pullover t-shirt emblazoned with the famous bunny logo. She also wore a pair of blue jeans, though these had been somehow removed or displaced and were discovered near her feet rather than on her body. This suggested to investigators that she may have been subjected to essay before she was slain. But given the state of her remains, this could never be proven definitively. Covering the upper portion of the remains was a man's brown corduroy jacket. This jacket, likely meant for a tall man, was draped over her, an odd detail that raised many questions. Was someone trying to cover her? Or had she borrowed a coat far too large for her petite frame? At any rate, investigators couldn't be sure. Likewise, another male garment was found with the body, a light-colored men's work shirt which had been left unbuttoned and placed over the remains. This was no ordinary work shirt. It featured an oval name patch on the chest with the name George embroidered in red thread. Another patch contained a distinctive company name, Doug Hyde Unlimited. This tangible name tag clue immediately stood out to detectives as a potential lead to identify either the victim or a person connected to her. Perhaps George was someone she knew, maybe the owner of the shirt, and perhaps that person had answers about her identity or last movements. Back at the Cobb County Police Headquarters and the medical examiner's office, the evidence was logged and analyzed. Unfortunately, in 1984, forensic technology was limited. With a skeleton and no immediate identification, the woman officially became a Jane Doe case. Fingerprints were obviously impossible to obtain from her skeletal hands, but investigators did have her teeth, and decades later DNA would be extracted from her remains. Initially, in the mid-1980s, detectives compared the young woman's description against missing person reports in Georgia and beyond. Initially, they were looking for any 18 to 25-year-old who might match her physical stats and unique injuries. They also followed up on the most concrete clue they had, the name George on that work shirt. Police traced the shirt back to Doug Hyde Unlimited, the company embroidered on the pocket. They discovered Doug Hyde Unlimited was an automotive repair shop in Atlanta. In 1984, the shop had an employee named George who would have worn that very shirt as part of his uniform. This seemed like extremely promising, to say the least. At minimum, George could potentially identify the victim if she had been an acquaintance, or provide further info on the work shirt and how it got there. Investigators did locate and interview the mechanic named George who had worked there. However, this lead fizzled. George didn't recognize the description of the victim and had no useful information on how his old work shirt might have ended up at a crime scene. It's unknown at present what explanation he gave to the police, but in the end, they found the lead to be a dead end. From early on, detectives formed theories about what might have happened to this young woman. Given the remote dump site, the lack of identification, and the lifestyle clues, one theory stood out. The victim could have been involved in escort work. This seems to have been largely based upon the logo on the clothing she was wearing, though the lack of reports of her being missing also factored in. A clay model of her head was sculpted, approximating her facial features. As usual with these clay models, they're somewhat uncanny, and it's obvious why they're no longer used. Ultimately, this forensic reconstruction didn't lead to any new tips, and from there the case went very cold. By 2011, the police confirmed that they had successfully obtained a DNA profile for the Jane Doe. This gave a new glimmer of hope, but no hits were found at that time. Over the years, numerous theories have emerged about who this young woman might have been and how she ended up in that wooded patch in Cobb County. One avenue investigators explored was whether she could have been a known missing person from the Atlanta area whose body simply wasn't recognized initially. At least half a dozen missing young women were compared and excluded through dental records or DNA, but none turned out to be this Jane Doe. The victim's unique prior injuries seemed like they should have been traceable to hospital records or known accidents, but those leads never panned out. No hospital in the region could find a matching surgical record, and it's possible the surgeries occurred out of state, further complicating the trail. Other theories have focused on the manner of her death and dumping. Who would go to the trouble of transporting a body out to a quiet, semi-rural corner by the Chattahoochee River? The location in Mableton wasn't a spot one would randomly stumble upon unless familiar with the area. This raised suspicions that the perp might have been someone local or someone who knew the back roads. The fact that the body was left quite openly suggests the perpetrator was in a hurry to abandon her. Some have suggested this slaying may be tied to a serial perpetrator, though there's nothing to suggest that this is the case. The Doug Hyde Unlimited shirt clue also presents its own theories. Perhaps the victim had a personal relationship with someone from that company. Did she perhaps borrow the shirt from George for warmth? Or could she even have been dating him or one of his co-workers? Or, if the police are correct, could she have had a client who worked at Doug Hyde Unlimited? Investigators tracked down the real George and apparently cleared him, but even so, some online sleuths believe he may have been involved. Personally, I find it hard to believe that someone would leave a shirt with their own name on it on an individual they had slain. It seems possible that someone may have stolen or found the shirt and hoped to use it to frame this George individual. That said, this is pure speculation on my part, and there's essentially a million reasons why that shirt could have ended up there. As of today, the Jane Doe found in the woods in 1984 remains unnamed, but she's not forgotten, and the case remains open. It's unclear at this point if any genetic genealogy companies have been retained to help on the case, since this seems to be a case that could be easily cracked, given the DNA situation. On January 17, 2024, a gruesome discovery was made in Dallas County, Texas. The decomposed remains of an unidentified woman were found abandoned in an overgrown, disused parking lot on the outskirts of Dallas. Dallas Police and the Dallas County Medical Examiner's Office launched an investigation immediately. The medical examiner's team carefully collected the remains and any evidence from the scene, while detectives canvassed the area for anything noteworthy. The condition of the body indicated significant decomposition, which at first suggested she might have been dead for weeks or even months. The overgrowth around the lot hinted that her body could have lain there for a long time without anyone noticing. However, forensic examination soon provided a clearer timeline. Despite the advanced decay, the medical examiner estimated a post-mortem interval of only about 3 days. In other words, this woman likely died just a few days before she was found. This was a surprising conclusion given the state of her remains, but in the heat and conditions of a Texas environment, bodies can deteriorate rapidly. From the remains, experts gathered critical details, including that she was a white female with blonde, partially graying hair. The medical examiner couldn't pin down her precise age, though she was believed to perhaps be in her late 30s or 40s. Notably, she bore multiple tattoos, each a potential clue to her identity. These weren't generic butterflies or hearts, and most were personal and specific, suggesting significant people in her life. One of these tattoos is extremely disturbing, but I'll go through the more mundane ones first. On her upper right arm, there was a tattoo of a scroll with the names Jack and Janet, and a date inscribed, June 3rd, 2012. Another tattoo on her lower right arm depicted a gargoyle statue. On one of her wrists, she had a small candy tattoo. On her leg, there was a tattoo of Calvin, from the comic strip Calvin and Hobbes, along with the name Jacob. And then there was the most startling tattoo, the words, property of Blake. The authorities haven't released where on her body this was, but seeing the phrase property of Blake tattooed on a person is deeply unsettling. It suggests a history that might have involved a controlling or abusive relationship. Such tattoos are generally seen in cases of partner violence or human trafficking, and in either case it's essentially a branding by another person. A critical part of the investigation was determining how this woman died. According to the public information available, the official cause of death was not immediately determined. Dallas police haven't publicly detailed any specific injuries or evidence for this being a slaying, but they did classify the case as an unexplained death under suspicious circumstances. In the absence of an official cause, The working assumption is that she met a violent end until proven otherwise. In the absence of an identification, investigators and amateur sleuths are left to theorize about who the Dallas County Jane Doe might be and how she met her fate. One theory centers on that disturbing tattoo, property of Blake. It's been speculated that Blake could have been a partner or trafficker who controlled her life. That said, it's also possible that the tattoo is old, and this Blake individual was a figure from her past and not necessarily connected to her end. Another theory is that she may have been part of a vulnerable or transient population, which could explain why no family immediately reported her missing. People in such circumstances can sometimes slip through the cracks of society. Their disappearances might not be noticed right away. Or perhaps her disappearance has been noted, just in another jurisdiction. She may have been reported missing in Ohio or Nebraska or anywhere else, and the authorities may not have put the cases together yet. She may even be from another country, with Canada presumably being the most likely candidate. Ultimately, to me, this seems like a case that should be fairly easy to resolve if awareness of her case was higher. The tattoos are very distinctive, and the forensic reconstruction is incredibly lifelike and accurate under the circumstances. That said, if this case can't be solved in the traditional way, this is yet another case that could be solved with forensic science. Presumably, the authorities have already extracted her DNA and compared it against CODIS and missing persons databases more broadly. The authorities could retain a genetic genealogy lab to construct her family tree and find her relatives. This would likely give the Jane Doe her name back and provide further information as to her last moments in life. If this fails, there's another route that could be taken as well. Isotope analysis of her teeth or bones could also be conducted to find out her geographic origins and determine if she was a local or not. If they can determine if she was from another state, this would allow the authorities to canvass that region with her image and details through local news and social media. Valentine's Day is usually a time for love and hope, but in 1978 it delivered something much darker. On that morning, a jogger made a gruesome discovery along a lonely road in Otay, California: the partially burned body of a teenage girl. The shocking find left authorities with a nameless victim and almost no clues, a mystery that remains unsolved decades later. She was small in build, around 5'1" and under 90 pounds, and wore blue denim overalls with a floral patterned white top, and notably, she had no shoes or socks on her feet. She was noted to be somewhere in her middle to late teen years, with the identification of her age being potentially hindered by her small stature. The girl had brown hair tied in a ponytail, and her right ear was slightly malformed, a distinctive detail that could have helped identify her if someone had reported her missing. The medical examiner estimated she had been deceased for about 2 days before the discovery. Investigators noted more disturbing clues. Her body had been set on fire after death, with most of the burns concentrated on her torso, while her face and limbs remained unscathed. In fact, the charring was heaviest around her lower abdomen, and her fingertips were burnt, likely an effort by the perpetrator to destroy evidence or hinder identification. They also observed the girl's left eye was swollen shut, her left cheek was bruised, and a front tooth was cracked in half. This indicated she had been beaten, perhaps over a prolonged period. An autopsy toxicology screen revealed a lethal amount of the painkiller Demerol in her body. Investigators concluded this overdose was the likely cause of death, firmly establishing the case as a slaying by poisoning. The medical examiner also noted the girl had extensive dental work, including a fairly recent root canal, which indicated she had received good dental care during her life. Investigators compared her dental records against missing persons databases, but found no match. Given the good state of her dental care, the authorities expected to be able to at least identify the girl quickly, but unfortunately, this wouldn't be the case. The crime received little media coverage in 1978, just a brief mention in a local paper, so it didn't generate many tips from the public. Later efforts to spark recognition, such as releasing an updated facial reconstruction in 2014 and highlighting the case in media, also brought no breakthroughs. Unfortunately, all sources list that no DNA is available in the case, and it's unclear where her remains presently are, but I'll get back to that in a moment. A number of theories have been proposed in this case. Some suggest the perpetrator was someone in the victim's life, possibly a family member or caregiver. If she came from an unstable home, it's conceivable that her own parent or guardian administered the fatal poisoning and then dumped her body, never reporting her missing. This would explain why no one came forward to identify her. The very people who should have sought her were responsible for her death. However, some have suggested the fact that she had good extensive dental work is contrary to this claim. After all, it does seem unlikely that a family who was treating their daughter in such a cruel way would at the same time be paying for extensive dental treatments. Another possibility is that she was a runaway or transient hitchhiker who fell prey to a dangerous individual on the road. In the 1970s, many teens hitchhiked, and some unfortunately encountered violent predators. The Otay Jane Doe could have left home voluntarily and then met someone who ultimately administered the lethal dosage. The brutal but hasty nature of the crime, signs of beating, an overdose, and a clumsy attempt to burn the evidence, suggests an impulsive act rather than a well-planned act. If she was far from her hometown, it would also make it harder to link her to any missing persons report. Another theory suggests that she may have fallen into a trafficking ring and been moved as far away from her home state as possible. Under this theory, she was perhaps a runaway who was taken advantage of. This theory explains why she had good dental care, and also why no one came forward to report her missing locally. It's very possible that another parallel case exists somewhere for this missing teenager under her actual name. Like with many cold cases such as this, that haven't received much attention at all, it's possible that word of the Otay Jane Doe simply hasn't reached the right people. Perhaps the next steps to bringing justice in this case would be to exhume her body, if it exists, and send her remains off to a state-of-the-art forensic laboratory. If a DNA sample can be obtained, genetic genealogy could locate this teenager's parents. Given the situation, it's possible that locating the parents could solve both her identity and the crime itself. As for now, the Otay Jane Doe remains one of the numerous unidentified victims of crime for whom justice has been so elusive. For decades, she was known only by a haunting nickname, Sahara Sue. In 1979, a young woman was found in the Las Vegas desert, and her identity remained a mystery for 44 years. Only recently did investigators discover her real name, Gwen Story, a 19-year-old from Ohio whose journey west ended in tragedy. Now that Gwen has her name back, the focus has shifted to uncovering who ended her life and why. On the night of August 14th, 1979, a passerby made a grim discovery in an empty lot off the Las Vegas Strip. Lying face down in the dirt near the old El Rancho Hotel site at Sahara Avenue and Las Vegas Boulevard was the body of a young woman. She had been dead only a few hours, and the cause of death was immediately clear: multiple stab wounds to her abdomen. Because she was found near the Sahara Hotel, investigators gave her the placeholder name Sahara Sue. It was a name that would stick with the case for decades, as the young woman's identity proved frustratingly elusive. At the scene, police noted puzzling details. The victim's body was partially unclothed. However, an autopsy indicated that this was likely due to a violent struggle rather than an indecent assault. Her jewelry, including a plain ring and two pendant necklaces, remained on her. Strangely, the victim was barefoot, and her shoes were missing from the scene. Investigators later theorized that the perpetrator may have taken some of her clothing as a grim souvenir. An empty liquor bottle nearby hinted that alcohol might have been involved. This suspicion confirmed when the coroner's toxicology report showed the young woman was extremely intoxicated. From the outset, Sahara Sue, as Gwen was then known, presented unique challenges to investigators. She appeared to be a teenager or in her early 20s, yet one detail made her stand out. She had no natural teeth. The victim wore a full upper denture despite her youth, an extremely unusual circumstance for someone who would eventually be identified as a 19-year-old woman. They took fingerprints and compared them against national databases, but found no match. With no ID and no immediate hits on fingerprints, the young woman was buried in a local cemetery under her Jane Doe moniker. Over the years, they exhumed her remains more than once in hopes of finding new leads. In 2003, her body was exhumed to obtain DNA samples, but no matches turned up in databases. Investigators compared her DNA to that of at least 7 missing women who fit her profile, ruling out multiple potential identities. They even compared her to a missing woman in the same age range who was known to wear dentures. Given this unusual fact, investigators thought there was a good chance they may resolve her identity in 2003. Unfortunately, however, this wasn't a match, despite this very unusual similarity. The mystery endured for 44 years, until advances in DNA technology finally provided the answers investigators needed. In 2022, the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department's Cold Case Unit teamed up with a private forensics lab, Othram, to apply cutting-edge genetic genealogical techniques. By late 2023, the painstaking work paid off, and investigators were led to a family in Ohio and to the name of a long-lost daughter. On December 19, 2023, authorities announced that Sahara Sue was formally identified as Gwen Marie Story. She was born in 1960 and grew up in the Cincinnati, Ohio area. Her family recounted to police that in the summer of 1979, 19-year-old Gwen decided to leave home on a quest to find her biological father in California. She had departed Cincinnati with 2 young male friends as traveling companions, hopeful for a fresh start on the West Coast. That was the last time her family ever saw her. According to what the friends later told Gwen's family, they did make it as far as Las Vegas, and that's where they left Gwen behind. The 2 men returned to Ohio in August 1979 without her, vaguely explaining that Gwen had stayed in Las Vegas on her own. The family never heard from Gwen again, and for 44 years they had no idea she was the unidentified victim in Nevada. Today, the death of Gwen Story remains unsolved, but the investigation has newfound momentum. Identifying her has opened fresh lines of inquiry for detectives, and they are actively pursuing several leads in an effort to finally name the perpetrator or perpetrators. One major avenue involves the 2 male friends who traveled with Gwen in 1979. Las Vegas police have stated that they are now turning their focus to those 2 individuals and trying to understand how Gwen wound up dead in Vegas after they left her. Another key lead centers on an unidentified man who was seen with Gwen shortly before her slaying. Back in 1979, during the initial investigation, police canvassed the area around the crime scene and discovered that a local liquor store clerk had seen the victim alive that night. The young woman matching Gwen's description had come into the store in the company of a man only a few hours before her body was found. This male companion was described as white, around 30 years old, approximately 6 feet tall with a thin build. Notably, the witness said the man sported a mustache that was a different color from the hair on his head, an odd detail that was incorporated into a police sketch at the time. Based on the timing and proximity, this unknown man is considered a suspect in Gwen's slaying, though he's never been identified. At present, detectives are essentially looking at two possibilities that may not be mutually exclusive. The first is that Gwen was harmed by a stranger she met in Las Vegas. The second is that she was harmed by someone she knew, perhaps one or both of her travel companions. There's always the potential that the scenarios intersect, and that she may have been trafficked by the original men, perhaps to the man she was seen with at the liquor store. That said, this is of course just speculation, and it's possible that the actual scenario of her final days is something completely different altogether. On a warm July day in 1990, 4 kiddos ventured out to pick berries in the woods of rural Pennsylvania. Wandering near an old railroad trestle in Monroe Township in Pennsylvania, they stumbled upon a chilling discovery. Lying face down in a muddy creek bed was what they first assumed to be a deer carcass. The group soon realized they had found something much more sinister. It was a human body. The victim was a young woman, and to this day her true name remains unknown. Investigators came to call her the Penny Doe, a haunting nickname drawn from the only coins found on her, a penny in each pocket of her jeans. This anonymous victim, found in the remote wilds of Clarion County in 1990, has since become the center of a decades-long mystery. An autopsy and crime scene examination yielded both clues and more questions. The victim was a white female, small in stature, with shoulder-length brown hair. Investigators determined she had been dead for approximately 2 months before the discovery, meaning she likely died in late spring or early summer of 1990. The cause of death was blunt force trauma. She had been beaten, suffering a devastating blow to the right side of her skull. She also had a broken right leg, yet another injury consistent with an extremely violent assault. Detectives found no purse or identification at the scene, and in fact, the young woman had very little with her. She wore a black short-sleeved shirt with a floral print vest, along with size 9 jeans. She had no shoes or socks on, or any undergarments, leading police to wonder if those items had been removed by the perpetrator to prevent biological evidence being found. Aside from her clothing, the only items recovered were the pennies in her pockets, a poignant detail that led to her moniker, the Penny Doe. Determining the victim's identity became the investigators' top priority. Initial forensic analysis in 1990 placed her age somewhere between her early 20s to early middle age. However, the physical evidence suggested a younger profile. The woman had healthy teeth with no obvious dental work or decay, and there was even a baby tooth still present in her upper jaw. These features were more typical of someone in her 20s rather than a woman in her late 30s. In fact, decades later, a fresh anthropological review of her skull and bones would narrow her likely age to roughly 22 to 29 years old, and her height to about 5 feet 3 inches. One front tooth was found to be chipped, though examiners couldn't be sure if that happened before death or during the violence inflicted upon her. These details painted a basic physical portrait, but nothing that immediately rang a bell in missing person databases. No local woman of that description had been reported missing. The mystery victim did not match any obvious cases in Pennsylvania, suggesting she might have come from elsewhere. With few leads, police turned to broader investigative methods. They widely distributed a composite sketch and even commissioned a full forensic facial reconstruction in hopes that someone would recognize the young woman's face. Despite these efforts, no one stepped forward to name her. From early on, police theorized that the key to the mystery might lie in the local community. The location where the penny dough was dumped was not easily happened upon by a stranger. It was a seldom traveled back road in a rural township, the kind of spot one might only find if they knew the area or explored off the beaten path. This led investigators to suspect that the killer could be someone local, someone familiar with that isolated creek bed. At the same time, they doubted the victim herself was from Clarion County. No one in the vicinity had reported a relative or friend missing who matched her. Further, they speculated that her style of clothing and brands weren't especially common in the area. Authorities believe she may have been brought into the region not long before her death, perhaps only a few weeks beforehand. In fact, one hypothesis emerged that Memorial Day weekend that year might hold a clue. On May 27, 1990, a large outdoor rock concert had been held about 15 miles from the spot where the penny dough was found. Over 5,000 people attended that event, and it was speculated that the unknown woman could have been among them. Some have speculated that she could have been from the western part of the country. Others have speculated that she could have been from a much more exotic locale, a little place to the north known as Canada. Under this theory, she might have traveled from elsewhere to attend the concert, and then crossed paths with a dangerous individual afterwards. Or perhaps she was trafficked to the concert location for more sinister purposes. However, this theory remained circumstantial, and there was no hard evidence she was at the show, and no attendee reports that clearly described her. It was an intriguing scenario, but ultimately just one of many possibilities. Still, the idea reinforced investigators' belief that someone in the area might have encountered this Jane Doe in the weeks before her slaying. As time passed, the case grew cold, with no further leads to pursue. Then, in the summer of 2003, a sudden hint of progress came out of nowhere. Authorities received an anonymous letter from someone claiming to have information about the young woman. The content of the letter has never been fully disclosed, but it was significant enough that police went public to plead for the mystery writer to contact them again. Investigators were hopeful that this could be the break they needed. Perhaps it was from someone with a guilty conscience, or a community member who had overheard a vital rumor. Unfortunately, that hope was dashed when the letter's author never came forward beyond the initial cryptic message. The anonymous tip faded into the background, leaving detectives to wonder if it had been a cruel prank or a missed chance at solving the case. By the 2020s, DNA technology and genetic genealogy had revolutionized the way unidentified remains can be identified. The Clarion County Coroner's Office, in collaboration with experts, worked to extract DNA from the penny doe's remains. Right now, this is where the case stands, and it's unclear where this genetic genealogy effort has led. It's also unclear if the Clarion County authorities have retained a service such as Othram to attempt to crack this case. With a little bit of attention focused on her case, the Penny Jane Doe can, at the very least, be given her name back. Whether her case can be solved from that point onwards remains unclear at present. Unfortunately, it doesn't appear that any biological material from the perpetrator was found at the scene, which will make cracking the case that much more difficult. But with her identity back, beyond the dignity it gives to her, this will allow investigators to start reconstructing this young woman's last days. On a quiet autumn morning in October 2012, a man walking along Zinjan Beach in Split, Croatia, noticed an unbearable stench coming from a discarded plastic bag. Inside, to his shock, was a rotting leg. This grisly discovery marked the start of one of Split's most perplexing unsolved mysteries: a dismembered John Doe whose remains would soon surface on two different beaches. Over a decade later, both the victim's name and his perpetrator remain unknown. The gruesome nature of the crime stunned the community at large and spurred an exhaustive police investigation, yet every lead only deepened the mystery. The first body part was found on October 8, 2012, when a passerby at Zinyan Beach stumbled upon a severed leg inside a plastic bag. This leg was confirmed to be human almost immediately, sparking the initial investigation. Just over a week later, on October 16th, another gruesome find was reported across town at the Zenta Harbor. A partially decomposed human torso was spotted wedged in the rocks of a marina breakwater. The torso had arms attached but was missing its head and both legs, clearly linking it to the earlier discovery. The following day, police divers searching the waters near that spot recovered the victim's head, which had been wrapped in newspaper and placed in its own plastic sack. No other remains were ever located despite extensive searches. All the recovered remains were sent for forensic examination, which confirmed they belonged to one individual. Investigators extracted a DNA profile from the victim's tissue and bone, but it didn't match anyone in Croatia's DNA databases. Fingerprints were also lifted from the plastic bag that held the head, offering a potential clue to the perpetrator, but these prints were of poor quality. The autopsy shed further light on the crime. The medical examiner determined that the John Doe likely died from severe chest injuries before being dismembered. He had multiple broken ribs. Early reports noted at least 8 fractures, as well as a broken collarbone and numerous bruises on his body, all inflicted while he was still alive. According to the coroner, these traumatic injuries suggested that the man either suffered a vicious beating or a catastrophic fall. However, given the subsequent events, the investigators were very clear that even if this was a fall, he didn't do it intentionally. The advanced state of decomposition made it difficult to determine how long the victim had been dead. Pathologists estimated he could have died anywhere from about 1 month to as much as a year before the remains were discovered. A forensic analysis was commissioned to try to figure out how the man appeared in life. The reconstruction showed an older white male who was balding and had short gray hair. He was likely around 5'10", and the investigation indicated he had significant dental work done in the past. Medical examiners also noted signs of kidney and heart disease, suggesting he was in poor health and possibly had mobility issues. These clues painted a picture of a man in his 60s or 70s who lived a quiet, perhaps housebound life. Armed with the composite sketch and physical details, Split police appealed to the public for help in identifying the unknown man. They urged citizens to consider whether any elderly male neighbor or relative had gone missing from their community. This focus on immobile seniors was based on the investigators' hunch that the victim had been frail and largely homebound. If such a person quietly disappeared, it might not immediately spark suspicion from neighbors or relatives. The perpetrator may have been able to simply pass it off as an instance where the man perished naturally, and given his poor health, further questions were unlikely to be raised. Despite exhaustive efforts, by the end of 2012, the case had grown cold. Not a single useful clue had been found, and the investigators' frustration grew as every potential lead hit a dead end. Over the years, several theories have emerged about what might have happened. Investigators strongly suspect that this man was targeted by someone he knew, most likely a caregiver. Indeed, police noted that the John Doe appeared to have led a very isolated life in Split or its outskirts, which would make it easier for his absence to go unnoticed for a long time. This profile supports the idea that the perpetrator took advantage of the man's solitude and vulnerability. Some have speculated that the motive could have been financial, for example, concealing the death to continue collecting the man's pension or for an inheritance. Another idea suggests that the reason why the man hasn't been discovered is that he wasn't a local at all. Split is an extremely popular vacation destination. It's possible that someone from elsewhere in Europe may have brought their elderly relative to Split under the auspices of a sunny vacation. During the vacation, this relative may have slain this elderly man and then covered it up using macabre techniques. This theory also has elements of the previous ideas discussed, since it may provide a convenient excuse for why someone is gone. If an elderly and unwell person from, say, France or Germany died on vacation in Croatia, this may not raise too many eyebrows back home from other relatives. Notably, this seems to be a case that would be ripe for solving with genetic genealogy if it happened in the United States or Canada. That said, it happened in Europe, and the laws surrounding genetic genealogy are different, so perhaps the Split John Doe case will remain sadly unsolved. In early 2025, nearly 60 years after Dorothy Vaillancourt disappeared, authorities finally put a name to a mystery that had haunted Northern California for decades. A set of unidentified remains found on a hillside in 1966 was positively identified as Dorothy, an Australian-born mother of 7. For decades, she was known only as the Marin County Jane Doe, but advancements in forensic DNA technology eventually cracked the case and brought partial closure to her family. Despite this, another question now looms. What happened to Dorothy and why? On December 18, 1966, a local hunter made a grim discovery near the end of Paradise Drive in Tiburon, California. He stumbled upon the body of a woman at the bottom of a brush-covered cliffside, about 20 feet down the hill from the roadside. The remains were in an advanced state of decomposition, and the coroner later estimated that the woman had been dead for approximately 2 months. The woman appeared to be middle-aged, roughly between 40 and 60 years old, standing about 5 feet 2 inches tall and weighing around 105 pounds. Due to the condition of the body, authorities could not immediately determine how she had died. No obvious cause of death could be established from the remains. It was clear, however, that this woman had died alone on a quiet Marin County hillside, and that no one had reported her missing. Investigators with the Marin County Sheriff's Office began working to identify the unknown woman. In the 1960s, tools like DNA profiling and nationwide databases didn't exist, so detectives relied on traditional methods. They checked missing persons reports, sent out bulletins across California, and scoured local leads. There was speculation that she might have been a patient who wandered away from a San Francisco psychiatric hospital or a traveler who had stayed at a nearby motel. Each lead, however, led nowhere, and the woman's identity remained a mystery. A crucial clue emerged a few days after the body's discovery. A Tiburon fireman came forward on December 21, 1966, to report an encounter he had remembered from 3 months prior. He told the sheriff's investigators that back in the late summer or early fall, a woman matching the Jane Doe's description had showed up at the local fire station. The woman had told the fireman she was stranded and didn't have money for a taxi ride. She asked if she could spend the night at the fire station or even borrow the firefighter's car, but he refused both requests and didn't take any further action. The fireman last saw her walking away down to Barron Boulevard in September 1966. This witness account strongly suggested that the unidentified woman found in December was the same person, meaning she had been alive and in distress a few months before her death. Despite this lead, investigators still did not know her name. With no identification and no immediate matches to missing persons, the case went cold. After the initial flurry of investigation in the late 1960s, the Marin County Jane Doe case lingered on the shelves of cold case detectives. The unknown woman was buried in an unmarked grave at Mount Tamalpais Cemetery in San Rafael, California, and for years her tombstone bore no name. All the while, Dorothy Vaillancourt's family was suffering, not knowing what became of her. Dorothy's 7 children had been separated from their mother in the mid-1960s. In fact, her family spent years actively searching for her, never imagining that the unidentified Jane Doe in Marin County was their missing mother. Dorothy's daughter, Penelope Vaillancourt, who was a teenager when her mother vanished, never gave up trying to find answers. She would ride buses through San Francisco, scanning the faces in the streets for a glimpse of her mother's familiar features. The family reached out to agencies like the FBI and local cold case units, and even checked cemeteries for unidentified graves, hoping for any clue to Dorothy's fate. At one point, Penelope even visited the Australian consulate in San Francisco, thinking her mother might have tried to return to her homeland. Her children suspected that Dorothy's disappearance might be tied to a man in her life, and without evidence of her death, they had little closure. The cold case of Marin County's Jane Doe finally saw progress in the 21st century thanks to forensic genealogy. In 2022, the California Department of Justice and the Marin County Sheriff's Office partnered with Othram to re-examine the evidence from the 1966 case. Othram was conducting a special program to tackle unsolved cases with no other leads, and the Marin case was a prime candidate. Using a process called forensic-grade genome sequencing, Othram's scientists were able to extract a comprehensive DNA profile from the decades-old remains. Once Othram had a DNA profile, their in-house forensic genealogists compared it against public genetic databases to find relatives. This painstaking family tree research eventually led to a break in late 2024. A set of genetic matches pointed to relatives of the unidentified woman. By reconstructing the family lineage, investigators homed in on a particular family with ties to Australia. In early 2025, Marin County Sheriff's officials contacted surviving family members of a long-lost woman and obtained DNA reference samples from them. These samples confirmed what the genealogy strongly suggested. The Marin County Jane Doe was Dorothy. The identification was formally announced on March 20th, 2025, ending the nearly 59-year mystery of the Jane Doe's name. Identifying the remains as Dorothy Vaillancourt also shed light on the life story behind the victim. She had been born Dorothy Jean Williams in 1917 in Hobart, Tasmania, an island state of Australia. She grew up in Tasmania and trained as a nurse, and during World War II, Dorothy was working at a Sydney hospital when she met a young American serviceman, Francois Vaillancourt. Francois, an American of French-Canadian descent who went by Frank, was a U.S. Marine who had served in the Pacific Theater. The couple married during the war, and after 1945, Dorothy left Australia to begin a new life with her husband in North America. They briefly stayed in Francois' hometown of Lowell, Massachusetts, then moved west to San Francisco, California, to settle down. In San Francisco, the Vaillancourts built a family, and Francois worked as a house painter, and Dorothy continued her nursing career in the city. They had 7 children together, and were initially a happy family. However, the good times weren't destined to last. The strain of raising a large family and personal issues took a toll on the marriage. The Vaillancourts eventually divorced in the early 1960s, and Dorothy struggled in the aftermath. She developed a serious alcohol problem and had difficulty holding down a job. Child welfare authorities became concerned about the children's care. Ultimately, the 7 kids were placed in group homes in the San Francisco area during the mid-1960s. Around this time, Dorothy became involved with a new man, one who would later factor into theories about her fate. She met a German immigrant named Hermann Julius Hess and remarried in June 1964. The pair bought a house in Fairfax, a town in Marin County north of San Francisco. At first, it may have seemed like a fresh start for Dorothy, but her new German husband had a dark side. He claimed to have been a figure of authority in the Third Reich, a claim that appears to have likely been made up to instill fear in Dorothy. Whether this was true or not, what was definitely true is that Hess had a violent temper. Penelope and her siblings later described disturbing incidents. In one confrontation, Hess punched 14-year-old Penelope in the face. When her brother intervened, Hess violently attacked the brother and tried to strangle Penelope until the police were called. In the wake of that incident, Hess was arrested. However, the records of this incident now appear to be lost to time. After Hess's arrest, the children, who had briefly been reunited with their mother, were removed from the home in Fairfax. Some of the children went back to live with their father, Frank, but others were sent to orphanages or foster homes. Dorothy remained with Hess in Marin County after the children were gone. By late 1965, Dorothy and Hess were struggling financially. They were court-ordered to sell their Fairfax home to cover debts. The historical record becomes spotty after that, but it appears that at some point in 1966, Dorothy and Hermann Hess separated or fell out of touch. Dorothy, battling alcoholism and having lost her stable home, essentially became transient. The last known sighting of her while alive was the encounter at the fire station in the fall of 1966. With Dorothy Vaillancourt's identity now established, the focus turns to how she died and what led to her body being left on that steep Tiburon slope. Unfortunately, this aspect of the case remains unsolved. Back in 1966, the coroner could not determine a cause of death due to the decomposition and lack of obvious injuries. All that could be said was that she likely died around October 1966, roughly 2 months before discovery, and that her death was not immediately attributable to any cause. Whether Dorothy's demise was the result of foul play, an accident, or some other misfortune is still unknown. The Marin County Sheriff's Office has not publicly stated whether they have reopened a criminal investigation now that Dorothy has been identified. As of the identification in 2025, officials simply acknowledged that the manner of her death is unclear and still under investigation. Several theories have emerged as to what happened to her. One theory points to Hermann Hess, Dorothy's second husband, as a possible culprit. Given Hess's documented violence toward Dorothy and her children, some of Dorothy's surviving family members believe he may have had something to do with her death. Perhaps, they speculate, Hess and Dorothy met one last time in 1966, and an altercation occurred that resulted in Dorothy's death. Supporting this theory is Hess's behavior and the timing. Dorothy vanished not long after separating from him. However, Hermann Hess himself is, with certainty, deceased, given that he was born in 1911. If Hess did harm Dorothy, he cannot be brought to justice now, but confirming his involvement would at least answer the family's lingering questions. Another theory is that Dorothy's death could have been a tragic accident or the result of exposure. It's possible that on the night she died, Dorothy was walking alone along the quiet road, perhaps under the influence. In her vulnerable state, she could have stumbled into danger. A hit-and-run incident is one potential scenario. A driver may have hit her and then, in a panic, tossed her body down the embankment to cover up what had happened. Alternatively, Dorothy might have simply lost her footing on the edge of the road and fallen down the slope, succumbing to injuries or exposure without anyone around to help. Another theory focuses on the somewhat odd actions of the firefighter who had seen her a few months prior to her discovery. This theory is entirely speculative, but as the last known person to have seen her alive, some have placed suspicion on him. It's unknown what investigative steps were taken with respect to him at the time Dorothy was discovered, and it's unknown whether he's still alive. Still another theory suggests that Dorothy may have intentionally went off the embankment in a successful effort to end it all. The evidence to support this is entirely circumstantial. However, Dorothy had essentially lost everything. Her family had been taken away from her, and her second marriage, albeit to an absolute monster, had just collapsed. Further, she was suffering from substance use issues, which may have compounded her existing problems. I hope to have an update on what happened to Dorothy in a future episode. On a tranquil summer day in 1991, beneath the elegant arches of England's Ouse Valley Viaduct, a chilling discovery shattered the peace. A young man's body was found hanging from a tree on a railway embankment just south of the viaduct, near the village of Balcombe in West Sussex. Over 3 decades later, this man remains unidentified, known only as the Balcombe John Doe. The John Doe was a young white male, estimated between 20 and 25 years old, about 5 feet 10 inches tall with dark brown curly hair and brown eyes. There were no signs of foul play, and the cops later noted that nothing suspicious was evident in his death. Yet the absence of identification and the mystery of his presence in that location turned this into an enduring investigation rather than a closed case. The young man carried no ID, no letters, and no obvious clues to his name or origin. He was ultimately laid to rest in a local churchyard, buried at St. Peter's Church in Ardingly, West Sussex, not far from where he perished. A simple grave holds his remains, but even today it bears no true name. Although his identity was a mystery, the Balcombe John Doe was not without personal items. In fact, the belongings found with him painted a poignant, if incomplete, picture of his life and possible journey. He was dressed in a blue denim jacket and jeans, a sweater over a gray shirt and blue t-shirt, white socks, and brown suede walking shoes. These were all topped off by a red and blue waterproof jacket, practical clothing for a young traveler. Among his possessions, investigators found a brown leather wallet with a bit of cash, a cassette player, 2 Beverly Craven music cassettes, and a Woolwich Building Society pen. Perhaps most striking was his choice of luggage. A small blue backpack decorated with a Mickey and Minnie Mouse motif, the kind a younger student might carry on a trip. He also carried a tourist map of London, suggesting he had been visiting the capital as a sightseer. Even his eyeglasses were notable, described as John Lennon-style round glasses with tinted lenses in a French-made Morel frame, hinting at an international connection. Without a concrete identity, theories have flourished. One compelling theory is that he may have been French or from a French-speaking country. This is supported by 2 intriguing clues. First, forensic examiners noted the style of his dental work appeared French or continental, differing from typical British dentistry. Second, a witness from around that time recalled that the young man spoke fluent French in conversation. He had the look of a traveler, and the items he carried, especially the tourist map, suggest he might have been visiting from abroad. Perhaps he was a student or backpacker touring England, passing through London and making his way south. Notably, Balcombe isn't far from London's Gatwick Airport, a likely entry point for foreign visitors, which lends weight to the idea that he wasn't local. Others have speculated that he could have been from elsewhere in Europe or even Canada, essentially any background that would explain fluent French and no UK records. Unfortunately, the story of the Balcombe John Doe hasn't received much attention at all, which may be why his case hasn't been solved. The story of his disappearance may be very well known, and it may simply be that no one has yet put 2 and 2 together. For now, however, we only know one half of his story, with the other portion of his story likely out there somewhere on the internet or in a police file, just waiting to be linked up. On May 19, 1996, beneath the span of the Clifton Suspension Bridge in Bristol, England, police discovered a young man's lifeless body on the rocky banks of the river below. His death, tragic and obscure, marked the beginning of an enduring mystery, which has now gone on for almost 30 years, despite the authorities believing this would be easy to solve. This case comes with a twist. The Bristol John Doe was found carrying a photograph of himself. Early morning joggers stumbled across the grim scene, alerting police immediately. Officers quickly deduced the man likely fell from the bridge, either intentionally or by accident. Physically, the John Doe was described as Caucasian, aged somewhere between 25 and 35, standing around 6 feet tall, with blue eyes and short, light brown hair. He wore simple clothing, a black leather jacket, dark sweatshirt, blue Lee Riders jeans, and brown boots, all of which was typical attire for a young adult in 1996. However, the belongings he carried painted a far more complex portrait of who he might have been. With him was a handwritten cardboard sign that read, quote, "Sleeping rough, thank you." Beside his body lay a black sleeping bag, which together with the sign was a good indication he was homeless. The additional items he carried appeared to confirm that this was the case. He carried personal grooming items, including disposable razors, deodorant, and a toothbrush, suggesting he took pride in his appearance, despite challenging circumstances. More intriguing were several other items that spoke volumes about his personality and possible interests. The John Doe possessed multiple maps, including a guide labeled Euro Hike Adventure, indicating possible extensive travels or an active interest in exploring. There was also a pack of silk-cut cigarettes and a tin whistle, raising the theory he might have bussed to survive, entertaining passers-by for spare change. It wasn't difficult to investigators to imagine that he placed the sign out to solicit donations while playing music. He also carried an interesting array of books which offered more insight into his life. Among them were a Batman comic anthology, a well-used Bible, and a copy of Thomas More's philosophical classic, Utopia. The battered copy of Utopia bore a library stamp reading West Glamorgan County Council. This suggested he may have passed through, or perhaps even originated from, the Swansea region of Wales. The blend of books spoke to a thoughtful, perhaps idealistic individual searching for meaning while also seeking escape in stories. Yet, investigators were most haunted by a passport-sized photograph he kept. Police believed it depicted John Doe himself at a younger age. The image showed a youthful man, possibly late teens or early 20s, with slightly longer hair and a more hopeful demeanor. Disturbingly, the photograph was found in a student-style ID holder, its identifying details deliberately scratched off. Whoever he was, it seemed that John Doe had consciously sought anonymity. The police conducted extensive searches for his identity, sharing the photo and information nationally. They checked missing person databases across the UK and even Europe, considering he may have been a foreign traveler or tourist. However, despite all these efforts, no match was found. With no family or friends stepping forward to claim him, the trail quickly went cold. Within weeks, John Doe's body was buried quietly, marked by nothing more than a case number. As the years passed, theories began to emerge about his origins and fate. Some believed he was a homeless man whose identity faded from society's radar, possibly someone estranged from family or struggling with mental health issues. This theory aligns with his transient lifestyle and the signs of hardship he carried. Perhaps he had deliberately left behind a previous life, erasing connections that might have brought people forward after his death. A second theory, however, suggests he might have been a former student or academic who had become disillusioned or lost. The philosophical book, Utopia, in particular, suggests a young man wrestling with ideas of society, fulfillment, or happiness. The deliberate removal of his personal details from the student ID could hint at someone intentionally severing ties to his past and seeking a new start. Another compelling possibility was that John Doe originated from outside England, perhaps continental Europe. Investigators noted his features suggested possible German or Dutch heritage, and the traveling gear and maps he carried raised the likelihood of a backpacker exploring Britain. Poor cross-border communication in the 1990s could have meant his disappearance was reported in his home country, never reaching British authorities. Questions also remain around the exact circumstances of his death. Police found no evidence of violence or robbery. His belongings remained undisturbed, suggesting he did it himself or that there was an accident. It's been suggested he might have visited the site out of curiosity or contemplation, only to slip and fall due to wet conditions. Unfortunately, the true events of that night remain a complete mystery. Despite the lack of any indications of violence, the homeless are much more likely to encounter violence than the general population. It does remain a possibility that the bridge, in essence, was used as a cover-up for a very serious crime in this case. Again, though, this is speculative given the lack of concrete evidence. Renewed attention in recent years, however, has brought fresh hope. In 2021, the nonprofit group Locate International reopened the case. They commissioned a modern forensic artist to create an updated facial reconstruction, digitally aging the younger photograph to reflect his appearance in 1996. This reconstruction was shared widely in the media, bringing renewed public interest to the long-forgotten case. Investigators reached out specifically to communities who frequented Bristol's streets in the mid-90s, uncovering vague memories, but no concrete identification yet. Despite decades passing, the key to solving the Bristol John Doe case isn't advanced forensics, it's awareness. Unlike most unidentified cases, where only partial information is available, here we have something incredibly rare. A photograph of what he actually looked like in life, taken when he was likely still fully connected to society. The photograph we have of him from the early 90s shows someone who was clean-cut and well-groomed and putting his best foot forward into the world. There are likely hundreds of people out there who would know who this John Doe is from this picture alone. They just haven't had the opportunity to see the photo. We also know what he looked like at the time of death, have detailed descriptions of his clothing, his belongings, and even his possible geographic history. This isn't a case lacking clues. It's one waiting for the right person to see his face and recognize him. His identity almost certainly lives in someone's memory, a former classmate, a friend from a shelter, or even a family member who lost touch. But without widespread exposure, that connection may never be made.